Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and last time I left you somewhere uncomfortable on purpose. We looked at the science of self control and found that a great deal of it isn't earned. It's substantially inherited, shaped in a childhood nobody chose, and actively degraded by the chronic stress that falls hardest on the people already carrying the most. And I said that when we praise the disciplined and condemn the struggling, we may be measuring luck and then charging people for it, which leaves an obvious question hanging in the air, and I've been sitting with it since. Okay, so what do we do? Because there's a version of that episode that ends in a shrug. If it's not really your fault and not really their fault, then nothing can be done and we all just drift. I don't believe that, and neither does the research. In fact, the research has a very specific answer, and it's one of my favorite findings in all of psychology because it takes a problem we've been trying to solve inside people for thousands of years and moves it about 3 feet to the left into the room around them. So here's our stride today: three moves, and they happen in this order because that's the order the science says they happen. First, we change how you judge other people, then, we change how you judge yourself. And then, once those two are unlocked, we change the rooms, the classrooms, the workplaces, the barns, the kitchens, the phone in your hand, because it turns out that's where self control was actually living the whole time. Let's take the first step, start with judgment, because the research here genuinely startled me. What you believe about where self control comes from does not stay a private philosophical opinion. It changes how you treat people, and it does so in ways you would probably never endorse if you saw them clearly. When self control is framed as a moral trait, failures get read as evidence of bad character rather than as a hard situation. That's not a huge surprise, but look at what happens when you push in the other direction. Parents who believed that character problems were more genetically caused reported using more psychologically controlling responses to their children's misbehavior. Sit with the shape of that. A belief that the child couldn't help it did not produce more warmth. It produced more control, more coercion, more pressure. And warm, responsive caregiving is precisely what actually supports a child's developing self regulation. So the belief made the parent worse at the exact thing the child needed. That finding stopped me because I had assumed that it's not their fault, it's their genes would land as compassion. Apparently, it can land as resignation, and resignation can look a lot like cruelty. So the useful belief isn't they can't help it. The useful belief is the one the evidence actually supports, which is that self control is shaped by genes and by parenting and by neighborhoods and schools and peers and trauma and predictability, all of it together, and that it can change. When people hold that view, self control starts to look malleable and context dependent rather than fixed. And that's the belief that supports both empathy and, crucially, doing something about it. And here is the practical thing that flows from it, the reason belief matters at all. If you think self control is essentially inner strength, you don't even notice that situational strategies exist. You can't reach for a tool you don't believe is a tool. Someone who believes discipline is a virtue you summon will keep summoning and keep failing and never once think to move the couch, change the route home, or take the thing out of the house. The belief doesn't just make you judgmental, it makes you blind. So that's the first move, and it's a quiet one. Stop asking what's wrong with the person and start asking what's happening in the situation, not as an excuse, as a search for the lever. Now, the second move, which is the same shift turned inward, and it's harder because we're so much more merciless with ourselves than we'd ever be with a friend. Here's the finding I want to hand you, and I think it may genuinely change how you see disciplined people. When researchers looked closely at people with high trait self control, they expected to find heroes of resistance, people white knuckling their way past temptation all day long. That is not what they found. People high in trait self control tend to prefer environments with fewer distractions, use proactive strategies, and experience less aversion during goal pursuit. Recent work argues directly that the benefit of high trait self control doesn't mainly come from doing more effortful resisting in the moment at all. Read that again because it upends the whole mythology. The disciplined person you envy is not outsuffering you. They are more often outarranging you. They have quietly built a life that asks less of their willpower, and then we look at the smooth result and call it character. And this pairs with a finding that should be far more famous than it is. Self control training, meaning programs that try to directly build up your willpower like a muscle, produces only small to moderate effects with uncertain mechanisms. Meanwhile, choice architecture interventions, which change the structure of the environment rather than the strength of the person, have been tested across more than 200 studies with a small to medium effect that consistently beats information only approaches. So, the thing our entire culture recommends, try harder, work on your discipline, barely moves the needle. And the thing almost nobody recommends, change the room, reliably does. Now, I owe you an honest tension here, and I've been turning it over since the last episode because it matters. There's a study where researchers experimentally undermined people's belief in free will, and what happened was that intentional inhibition dropped and their sense of self control fell with it. Tell someone their choices don't really belong to them, and they exert less control, not more. So, how do I square that with an episode that just told you self control isn't fair and isn't fully yours? Here's how, and it's the intellectual center of this whole episode. The point was never that you have no agency. The point is that your agency lives somewhere other than where you've been looking for it. It isn't in the clenched jaw at 11 at night in front of the open fridge. That's the moment you almost always lose, and losing it says nothing about your worth. Your agency lives earlier, upstream, in the choices about what's in the fridge, what time you eat, whether the kitchen light is even on. Agency doesn't disappear, it relocates. And that relocation is the most freeing idea in this research because the upstream moment is the one where you actually have power. There's even a belief that seems to buy back some capacity directly. Adolescents who believed that stress can be beneficial were less likely to feel distressed after hard events, and that buffered the decline in their self control that stress would otherwise have caused. So, how you interpret the pressure changes how much the pressure costs you. Not because stress is secretly good, and I'm not going to sell you that, but because the story you tell about the strain is part of the strain. Which brings us finally to the third move, the one this whole episode has been walking toward: change the room. The core principle is beautifully simple, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Situational strategies work because they act early before the impulse has grown teeth. An urge is weak when it's distant and strong when it's close. So the fight you can actually win is the one you have long before the fight. Every ounce of effort you spend at the moment of temptation is effort spent at the worst possible exchange rate. Move upstream, and the same ounce buys far more. And when researchers pooled all those choice architecture studies, one finding rose above the rest. The interventions that change decision structure, meaning what the options are and how they're arranged, outperform the ones that just give people better information. Telling people the right thing to do is the weakest lever we have. Making the right thing the easy thing is one of the strongest. Food environments turned out to be especially responsive, with effects up to 2.5 times larger than in other domains, which any of us who have tried to eat well in a kitchen full of snacks could have told them. So let's get concrete, because this is where it becomes usable. Take a classroom. The intervention that works isn't a lecture about grit. School programs do best when self regulation supports are built into the routine of instruction itself, so the structure carries the child rather than the child carrying the structure. And here is the finding that should be shouted from a rooftop. In universal school self regulation programs, one study found the largest effects in children at the greatest conduct risk. The kids were most likely to write off as impossible were the ones design helped most. Take a barn And I mean that literally, because the agricultural research makes this point better than anything else I found. When researchers looked at protecting farm workers from pesticide exposure, education only programs improved people's knowledge and their attitudes, but did far less to reduce actual exposure. What worked was giving people protective equipment, washing supplies, proper storage containers, laundry services, home visits. In other words, telling a tired farm worker to be more careful is nearly useless. Handing him the gloves and putting the sink where his hands already go is not. The barrier was never his character. It was that the safe action was harder than the unsafe one, and no amount of exhortation changes that arithmetic. Take a workplace. In one review of interventions for healthcare workers, only 3 studies out of 33 were actually organizationally focused. And those were the ones targeting workload, job crafting, and peer support rather than individual fortitude. Think about what that ratio tells you. We keep offering people resilience workshops when the problem is the workload. We're trying to strengthen the swimmer instead of turning down the current. And take your own life, because you don't need an institution's permission for this one. Researchers call it self nudging, and it means becoming the architect of your own small environment. Remove the option, set the default, add friction to the thing you don't want, and take friction away from the thing you do. Put the phone in another room, not because you're weak, but because you're smart enough not to fight a battle you don't have to have. Leave the running shoes by the door. Delete the app rather than resolving nightly to resist it. None of this is a confession of poor character. All of it is what the disciplined people were quietly doing all along. One refinement worth knowing because it makes you better at this. Self control conflicts come in different shapes. Sometimes the problem is starting, sometimes it's persisting, and sometimes it's resisting. And the research finds that changing your environment works especially well for the resisting kind, which makes sense because you can genuinely remove a temptation from a room, but you can't remove the difficulty from a hard task. So match the tool to the conflict. If you can't stop scrolling, change the room. If you can't start writing, that's a different problem and it needs a different lever, like a smaller first step or a firmer appointment with yourself. And here's the equity finding that ties this all the way back to last week's episode. And honestly, it's why I wanted to make this one. People with lower trait self control appear to benefit more from these preventive environmental strategies than from late stage effortful ones, which means good design doesn't just help everybody a bit. It narrows the gap. It helps most exactly the people we've spent centuries blaming. But then comes the sting, and I won't hide it from you. Access to environmental strategies is not evenly distributed. Being able to select and modify your surroundings is itself a resource. People with more money have more environmental options for self control, and disadvantaged people face more barriers to using the very strategies that would help them most. You can't put the phone in the other room if you don't have another room. You can't leave the tempting food out of the house if the cheap food is the tempting food. So, the freedom to design your environment is itself unequally distributed, which means that schools and workplaces and public policy have a real obligation here. They can widen access to the practices that individuals cannot always reach on their own. So, let me pull the whole stride together. Last week, we found that self control isn't fair. This week, the answer to that isn't resignation, and it isn't shame, and it certainly isn't trying harder at the exact moment you're weakest. The answer is design. You change how you judge others because the belief that discipline is a moral trait makes you both harsher and, strangely, blinder, unable to see the levers sitting right there in the situation. You change how you judge yourself because the disciplined people were never out suffering you, they were out arranging you, and your agency was never in the white knuckled moment. It was upstream, waiting for you in the design of the day. And then you change the rooms because making the better thing easier is the single most reliable move in this entire literature, and it helps the struggling most. Here's what I hope you carry out of this one. Stop trying to become the kind of person who can resist the room. Start becoming the kind of person who designs the room. And then, because this part matters too, start noticing whose rooms were designed against them and use whatever influence you have as a teacher, a manager, a parent, a neighbor to make the good thing the easy thing for somebody who has been running out of willpower in a place that was never built for them to succeed. That's the stride from blame towards something you can actually build. Thanks for walking it with me. I'm Esther Adams. This has been Strides to Solutions, and I'll see you next time.